Hi there, I'm Julie Orringer, MacDowell Board Member and Fellow, and I'm delighted to welcome you tonight to I Was Becoming, a reading and conversation with Elif Batuman, Chelsea Bieker, and Monica Sok. This event celebrates more than a decade of partnership between MacDowell and the Rona Jaffe Foundation and their mutual interest in supporting creative artists. It also celebrates both organizations' commitment to supporting new work by women, especially those whose voices are just beginning to be heard in the literary world. As part of its commitment to vital cultural institutions throughout the country, the Rona Jaffe Foundation generously endowed a fully funded fellowship at MacDowell in 2008 in honor of celebrated author Rona Jaffe. Each year, this fellowship supports an emerging woman writer with a MacDowell residency and a stipend of $2,500. 12 incredible writers have been supported by the Rona Jaffe Fellowship at MacDowell, including Carolyn Byrne, Aurora Masum Jayed, and Yahira Lawrence. I was also a recipient of the foundation's support as the 2008 Rona Jaffe Foundation Fellow at the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers of the New York Public Library. So I can tell you firsthand how deeply encouraged I felt by the foundation's support and how lucky I was to be able to continue my work at MacDowell. A partnership between these two institutions is not only natural, it's profoundly powerful. Donor-funded named fellowships in each of MacDowell's 7 disciplines fund over 100 residencies annually, offering crucial support to our program. You can learn more about MacDowell's history and fellowships and about the Rona Jaffe Foundation's widespread programs of support for emerging women writers on our respective websites. There'll be more info both about MacDowell and the Rona Jaffe Foundation at the end of this video. Now I'm so excited to introduce our readers. So our first reader tonight is going to be Chelsea Bieker. Chelsea is the author of the novel Godshot, which was longlisted for the Center for Fiction's first novel prize and named a Best Book of 2020 by NPR, and the forthcoming story collection Heartbroke, which is going to be out in 2022. Her writing has been published by the Paris Review, Granta, The Cut, McSweeney's, Lit Hub, Electric Lit, and many others. She is the recipient of a 2018 Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award and a 2014 MacDowell Fellowship. Originally from California's Central Valley, she now lives in Portland, Oregon with her husband and 2 children, and she teaches writing. Our second reader tonight is going to be Monica. Monica Sok is a Cambodian-American poet and the daughter of former refugees. She is the author of A Nail the Evening Hangs On. Her work has been recognized with a Discovery Prize from the 92nd Street Y and the 2016 Rona Jaffe Foundation Fellowship at MacDowell. She's also received fellowships and residencies from Poetry Society of America, Hedgebrook, Elizabeth George Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, Kundiman, Jerome Foundation, the Saltonstall Foundation, and others. Sok was a 2018-2020 Stegner Fellow, yay, at Stanford University and has taught poetry to Southeast Asian youth at Bante Stray and the Center for Empowering Refugees and Immigrants in Oakland. She is originally from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And finally, Elif Batuman. Elif's first novel, The Idiot, was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize in Fiction. She is also the author of The Possessed, a collection of comical, interconnected essays about Russian literature, which was a finalist for a National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism. She's been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2010, and she holds a doctoral degree in Comp Lit from Stanford. Elif was a 2018 MacDowell Fellow and the 2007 Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award winner. So here's a little bit of housekeeping before we start. Chelsea is going to read first, and then Monica, and finally Elif. After the readings, I'll be leading a 30-minute Q&A with questions that we've collected in advance from the audience, and maybe I'll slide in a question or two of my own. I also want to encourage everyone watching today to purchase these incredible writers' books. I'm going to be showing them to you as we go through the evening. So this isn't the last time you'll see them, but I just wanted to take at least a moment to put them all on the screen. We have linked our book titles on our event page, so you can buy them from the local bookstore Toadstool in MacDowell's hometown, Peterborough, New Hampshire. Toadstool is one of my favorite places in the world, so I heartily encourage you to buy these books from Toadstool today. And with that, Chelsea is going to begin. So without further ado, Chelsea Bieker.
Hi, thank you so much, Julie, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm just so honored and grateful to be here with you all tonight. So I'm just going to be reading from the beginning of my novel, Godshot. To have an assignment, Pastor Vern said, you had to be a woman of blood. You had to be a man of deep voice and Adam's apple, and you should never reveal your assignment to another soul, for assignments were a holy bargaining between you and your pastor and God himself. To speak of them directly would be to mar God's voice, turn the supernatural human, and ruin it. So not even my own mother could tell me what her assignment was that unseasonably warm winter, wouldn't tell me months into it when spring lifted up more dry heat around us and everything twisted and changed forever. I longed to know where she went when she left our apartment each morning, returning in the evening flushed, a bit more peeled back each time. I imagined her proselytizing to the vagrants sleeping on rags in the fields at the edge of town, combing the women's mud-baked hair, holding their hands, and exorcising evil from their hearts. I imagined her floating above our beloved town of peaches, dropping God glitter over us like an angel, summoning the rain to cure our droughted fields. I imagined all these things with a burn of jealousy, for I had not received my woman's blessing yet, the rush of blood between my legs that would signify me as useful. I just turned 14, but was still a board-chested child in the eyes of God and Pastor Vern, and so I prayed day and night for the blood to come to me in a river, to flood the bed I shared with my mother. Then I would be ready. I could have an assignment too. That spring, Pastor Vern decided we were due for a congregation-wide revival. We filled an abandoned bathtub behind the church with liters of Checkmate Cola, and one by one he held us under just long enough for the lungs to burn, for fearful desperation to set in, and we came up gasping and sticky, his face the first face we saw, a god to us. Our tongues darted to catch the sugar drops falling from our brows. How we cheered as the sugar dried on our skin under the ruthless burn of the sun. There was no wasting water, and so the soda would do. It was such a small sacrifice to use soda instead of water that I almost mistook it for a thrill. After the baptisms, he lined us up. He paced like a mad daddy. The valley floor had sunk 13 inches over the last year alone, and where, Pastor Vern asked, did we think we were going? Of course, we already knew. Hell was always waiting. He said in order to save the land we so loved, we would need to step over the lines of comfort, to open our arms, span them wide, and risk being shot down by God. He fell straight as a post onto his back to demonstrate. I spread my arms, my mother next to me, other mothers beyond her and their girls. The boys and the men were there too, but it's the girls I notice most, girls like me, ready. I thought we looked tough lined up like that, like soldiers, the hay-dead field our battleground, that vast open plain of beige nothingness surrounding. I remembered what had once been here, a land so fertile you could throw the pit of a peach after eating the sweet flesh from it, and underfoot would sprout up an orchard. How we had walked lightly over the dirt, electric with the possibility of small seeds creating bounty, lettuces and kales shimmering opulent, where before there had been only earth. But now all was dry, and the steady stream of infidels we might recruit was dwindling. No one wanted to have a rodeo here anymore. No one wanted to hold an agriculture convention where there was no agriculture. And without new believers, how would we ever offer Pastor Vern's message to the world? How could anyone trust the faith of God's own chosen people if they could not restore their land? Pastor Vern stood up and looked straight at me. There might have been crows in the sky circling. There might have been a child's cough or an old man's sniffle or sneeze from all that dust, or the scraping shift of bare feet in the hot dirt. I thought maybe Vern would look at everyone this way, and maybe he did, but I couldn't see anything beyond the way he was looking at me. Like he knew me through and through, eyes saddened by my natural-born sin, yet still hopeful. There was no sound but for my own blood rushing in my ears. I felt a wave of desire rise up in me. I could have jumped into his arms. He looked, and finally he made a gun of his hand and pointed it at my face, pulled the trigger. Rebaptized or not, the next day brown water still ran from our taps, but praise, it turned clear by the time we counted to 10. It was dawn, and I perched on the bathroom counter in one of my mother's camisoles, a black silky thing that felt glamorous, but she liked to remind me it was 100% polyester, not silk. I wore 2 small underwear she picked up from Goodwill that were clearly meant for a little boy, a penis hole in tractors. I didn't complain. She wore nothing, mowed over by the heat, and leaned toward the mirror, smoothed cream foundation over her sweaty skin, even though it would slide off before she walked out the door. Holy, holy, praise Almighty, she sang. Our King is here, he is here. Hell is hot, don't drink the water. Stand and feel the fear. I was past the point of desiring sleep at this hour. What I desired most was time with her. I handed her the mascara, and she craned her head back and opened her mouth as she raked black ink through her lashes, smudged raspberry glow into the hollows of her cheeks. I eyed her body, the thicket of brown hair between her legs. She told me she never nursed me a day in her life, and that's why her breasts were still buoyed up on their own instead of sinking down in flaps of sadness. She was very concerned that one day they would give up, so she gave them little pep talks. Come on, girls, don't fail me now. Ready, steady. I loved watching her. My mother was the sun in a dark room. Can I try, I asked, hungry to look like her, to do my makeup like her, or better yet, to have her lean close and do it for me. But her eyes settled on my crotch. Lacey may, she whispered. She wiped a finger across my thigh and then held it to the light. We both saw it, the red smear. I looked down at myself. It was as if something deep inside me had cracked open and now wanted out. I jumped off the counter and pulled her to me, but her arms stayed by her sides. Looks like you're ready for a real spiritual assignment now, she said into my hair. Like yours, I asked. She pulled away sharply, but then softened. He'll have something special just for you. I felt a surge of new selves tingle within me. I didn't like the way my mother's face flickered when she saw my first blood. I could read her so well. I could tell something troubled her. But it seemed selfish of her when now I was finally a woman. Surely the rebaptism had sparked this flow, and I smiled with that warm believer's glow of confidence that came from answered prayers. I primed my eyes toward destiny. I would have an assignment, and Pastor Vern would bring the rain at the right time, and the town trusted him and loved him, and all God's people would be tended, and the crops would persevere. Amen. Thank you.
Chelsea, that was fantastic. I absolutely loved that scene, the tension between mother and daughter at that moment is just so potent. So thank you. I'm so glad you read that. We are now going to hear from Monica. All right, take it away when you're ready.
Thank you so much for having me here. And that was a beautiful reading, Chelsea. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to read from my book, A Nail the Evening Hangs On. And I'll just begin with this poem about my grandmother. It's called The Weaver. She threaded the loom with one strand of her long silver hair, which might have kept growing until she was done, which might have fallen out. But I would come in and sit beside her on the cushion without her noticing, and she would continue. Every day I saw this old woman weaving at her loom, rivers and lakes underneath her hair, the bottom full of silt. I could see it if I reached with a comb, and that was when she'd look at me. Under her hair, she kept her oldest son, who was out for a morning swim, with swallows swooping down to touch the water. It made her happy as she worked on silk dresses, and her hair never ran out. Sometimes, when she was tired, she'd tie it up and let all the tired animals around her house drink from her head. The next 2 poems are poems that I have worked on at MacDowell, and I'm really happy to be able to share them with you today. The first poem is called Sistina. There's a sister who works so hard she never talks, A sister who screams when she hears dogs bark. A sister whose breasts have grown dry. A sister who always hides. There's a time comrades come to the hut. They can't tell who's who. How many are you? Where's the other one hiding? That sister stays close, somewhere in a hole closed off with dirt. Sometimes she sits with a sister whose baby lacked milk. In her place of hiding, she cries, thinks of comforting words, but her mouth goes dry. In a far village where works the sister who never talks, the sunset. Finally, it's her chance, time to run back. But this time an owl screeches. She closes her eyes. She disappears, pretends she's the one who can fly. That sister so quiet. How does that sister stay quiet? Biting her lips, she goes into hiding. Between her teeth, the skin of a snake, hiding like a chasm in a field, a hole in the door to spy on the time, dark knot high up in a greasy tree, little dry well in a forgotten yard, where sounds of smoke and fighting drive close. One sister soils her sarong. To wash it, the sister search for water, but find full of air a balloon which, swollen in the river, makes the youngest scream and cry, she who holds hands walking around the open eyes, her own face hiding. Then the sister who never speaks begins to speak. I want to go home, she says, but home is not close at all. No salty plum juice, no rice or fish dried. That dream is dry. And tracing with a stick, a sister who closes a circle around them in the dirt, hiding them safely inside. This is a circle, a time warp around us sisters, so we can go back to when we were girls not hiding, when fear didn't dry us up, and we could be whoever we were, dear sisters. That poem is about my mother and her sisters during the Khmer Rouge regime. And the next one is called Windfall. And this one I wrote because I had met a conservationist who had worked in Cambodia when I was on my residency at MacDowell in 2016. Windfall. The fishermen, desperate, poisoned them with a cloudy gasoline, so they dropped like apples to the ground underneath a tree. Except these were birds out of water, the conservationist said. Saurus cranes, their long legs still wet, were sold for $200 each at the border market where Thais bought them and turned around. After the war, that was how the local villagers made money. The cranes, near extinction, migrated to waters near a Khmer Rouge holding, where no one dared go, not that a mandate said keep out, no sign written in blood. They rationed their food, knowing the pendulum of war could swing any time, and they'd need something to eat before evacuating. They were sure it wasn't over. Invisible, the egrets and ibises, invisible, the forests of the eastern border to the one they shared with Laos. This is why the wind blows a drought hard across the land, tonnage of life destroyed in the invisible, invisible land. And I'll end with this poem about my mother. The woman who was small, not because the world expanded. The elephants came out from the fields and carried me toward Chamba, toward a village doused in fires, so that in the pond fish had fried, and looking at that dead water was a woman I had seen running home each evening with a bucket in her hand. Always her speed was the hair that flew in my face, always her feet sounding of tanks which made dogs bark and flee, footprints deep as trenches in the grass. This is the woman who had shrunk so small when the planes came, nobody could ever find her. And since more planes, she stayed as small as a spoon, and the world seemed to enlarge though nothing had changed. And when she saw me, she hid, threw pebbles at my ankles until I bowed down and easily picked her up, folding her inside a banana leaf. She slept. She slept well. She who is my mother, sleeping off the world again, whose person I hold in my hand when she wants to be held. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, Monica, I just have been holding these poems in my head ever since I finished this book, and it's just so incredibly rich with images that I would have never juxtaposed or thought about in such incredible detail. You've brought a world to life in a way that feels very brave to me, because it's an experience that you're rescuing from stories that might otherwise have disappeared. I was really grateful for this book, and so thank you so much for bringing it to us. And that was an incredible reading. And now we're going to hear from Elif. Elif, you are on.
Thank you so much, Julie. And both of those readings I thought were completely mind-blowing. And I'm so excited to be here supporting institutions that support such cool people. I am going to read from the beginning of an unpublished draft of my second novel, which is nominally a sequel to The Idiot, but I feel very strongly that people should be able to read it by itself. Okay, I'm just going to start from the beginning, and it's a draft. I just turned in the whole thing, so it might be a little rough. Chapter 1. It was dark when I got to Cambridge. It was September 1st, but it still felt like summer. I pulled my mother's suitcase over the cobblestones toward the river. Riley had been really mad when we were assigned to Mather and not to one of the historic ivy-covered brick buildings where young men had lived in ancient times with their servants. But I wasn't into history, so I liked that the rooms in Mather were all singles and nobody had to figure out how to share an irregularly sized suite where people had lived with their servants. I hadn't spoken to Ivan since July when we said goodbye in a parking lot on the Danube. We hadn't exchanged phone numbers since we were both going to be traveling, and anyway, we never had talked much on the phone. But I had never doubted that when I got back to school in the fall, I would find an email from him explaining everything. It was not, after all, conceivable that there was no explanation, or that the explanation could come from anyone else, or that it could come in any way other than email, since that was how everything had happened between us. I just realized that I forgot to say that this is set, it's taking place on September 1st, 1996, which will make it make more sense. Okay. Mather resembled an alien starship, impregnable, simultaneously ancient and futuristic, gathering its powers. I held my ID card in front of the reader, and the door to the computer room clicked open. I found myself remembering a book I'd read where a woman looked in a mirror for the first time after 7 years in a gulag, and the face looking back wasn't her own, but that of her mother. I immediately recognized how shameful, self-important, and obtuse it was for me, an American college student who hadn't checked email for 3 months, to compare herself to a political prisoner who had spent 7 years in a gulag. But it was too late. I had already thought of it. I mistyped my password twice before I got it right, and the computer started spitting out information about itself and the different protocols it was using, about when and where it had last seen me, and then the sentence that sent a jolt to my heart: "You have new mail." Ivan's name was there, just like I had known it would be. Before reading the message through, I looked at it all at once to see how long it was and what it was like. Right away, I could tell something was wrong. "So something is wrong," I read. I saw the words "shocked" and "monster." "I am very shocked that you see me as such a monster." It said, "I know you won't believe anything I say, and I hope you will tell me why I am so horrible so that I can defend myself." I had to reread the whole message twice before I understood what had happened. Ivan had sent this email 3 months ago in June in response to an angry email I had sent him right before leaving campus. Technically then, this communication had been invalidated by all the things that had happened between us in the intervening months. And yet, it still felt like a new and final word from him. For although there were several other messages in the inbox, none was from Ivan. He hadn't written anything to me at all in the 8 endless weeks since the parking lot, since he had held me so close to him and then gotten in his car and driven away. Most of the rest of the emails were also months old and out of date. There was one from Peter that said, "I desperately need to know your flight arrival time in Budapest," and another from Riley asking if it was okay to apply to overflow housing so we wouldn't have to live in Mather. Only 2 messages were from the past couple of days. One said that I had to see my financial aid officer at the earliest opportunity. The other, from the new president of the Turkish Students Association, said that somebody had found a store in Brookline that sold Kayseri-style pastırma, a kind of cured meat that some people said was etymologically related to pastrami. "So if you like Kayseri-style pastırma, you can go there," his message concluded. I exited the email program and used the terrible finger command to see where Ivan was. He had logged on from Berkeley 2 hours earlier, so he was there. He just wasn't writing to me. I'm going to read just a little bit from the next chapter. Svetlana got to campus the day after me, although it felt like years. I had already slept the night in my new room, eaten breakfast and lunch in the cafeteria, and made numerous trips back and forth to the storage facility with a hand truck running into large numbers of people whose existence I had completely forgotten about. "How is your summer? How is your summer? How is your summer? How is Hungary?" I was dissatisfied by the vagueness of my own answers. I hadn't figured out the right angle. "How was Hungary?" my friend Lakshmi asked at lunch. "Did anything happen?" Notwithstanding my strong feeling that a lot of things had happened, I answered the question truthfully in the sense that I knew Lakshmi intended it. Nothing had happened. The next evening, I met Svetlana at her new room, and we talked about all the things that had happened since we last saw each other. I told her how I had finally called Ivan in Budapest, how he had showed up with a canoe, and we had sat up all night at his parents' house. "Did anything happen?" Svetlana asked. "Well, like that one thing didn't happen," I said. "Selin," Svetlana said. "I know," I said. "Did I though?" When Ivan first told me about the summer program in Hungary, he said I should take my time to think about it because he didn't want to force me into anything. Svetlana said that if I agreed to go, that meant that Ivan was going to try to have sex with me. This was a possibility I had never previously considered. I had daydreamed about Ivan all the time, imagining different conversations we might have, how he might look at me, touch my hair, kiss me. But I never thought about having sex. What I knew about having sex did not correspond to anything I had wanted or had felt. I had tried on multiple occasions to put in a tampon. Tampons were spoken of by older or more sophisticated girls as being somehow more liberated and feminist than maxi pads. I just put one in and forget about it. I felt troubled by the implication that a person was constantly thinking about their maxi pad. Nonetheless, every few months, I would give tampons another shot. It always went the same. No matter what direction I pushed the applicator, however methodically I tried all the different angles, the result was a blinding electric pain. I read and reread the instructions. Clearly, I was doing something wrong, but what? It was worrisome, especially since I was pretty sure that a guy, that Ivan, would be bigger than a tampon. But at that point, my brain stopped being able to entertain it. It became unthinkable. Svetlana said I'd better think about it. "You wouldn't want to end up in that situation and not have thought about it," she said, plausibly. And yet, it turned out there wasn't much to think about. It was obvious to me that if Ivan tried to have sex with me, I would let him. Maybe he would be able to tell me what I had been doing wrong, and it wouldn't be as terrible as trying to put in a tampon. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
I just feel like you've given us this gift, like you've given us this sneak preview of this book that follows a book that is so dear to my heart and that I read with an experience of commingled kinship, empathy, shame, delight, and just pure awe at what you managed to do. So Thank you so much for reading. Thanks to all of you for reading. Those were just incredible passages to hear in juxtaposition to one another. And I just love, I love how different these works are, and that we're going to now engage in a conversation that's going to span so much creative difference. So let me start then by asking a few questions about the books themselves. I wonder if each one of you, maybe starting with Chelsea, could talk a little bit about where the book started. I mean, this is a question that that you've probably heard at a number of readings. Some people say that your books start with a single scene that you envision or a sentence that comes to you. I'm just wondering what your experience was like. Where did this particular work originate, and how did it unfold?
Yeah, so I actually wrote the first draft of Godshot at MacDowell in 2014, in all that wonderful space and time I was gifted. And I wrote it originally from the perspective of the mother. So it was a really different book, but for me, you know, they're so similar. If you were to read them both, they would seem not as connected. But at the end of that, of writing that draft from her perspective, I woke up at MacDowell one day and realized I had to try it from the daughter's perspective. And I was really proud of myself for reaching the end of this first draft. And I didn't really want to, you know, kind of start over, but I had to listen to that voice. And I'm glad that I did. I think once I clicked in with the daughter's perspective, it was clear that I was more interested in her vantage point. But you know, what remained was some of the images from the mother's recollection of her childhood with the grandmother in the book. I think the grandmother's house was such a rich place for me and felt really tactile. And in many ways, that was almost where the book started, even though it's not actually where the book starts now.
Great. Great, thank you so much. What about you, Monica? What was the origin of this particular book?
I think that I began writing this book because I myself did not exactly, I was not told these stories growing up about the Khmer Rouge regime, which my family had lived through in the 70s. And it was just a really big part of my history, a part of my family history that I wanted to explore. So when I was on my residency as well, I wrote most of my book. And I think everything that I did after, I just had to keep revising into, like, I think I had my manuscript kind of laid out, you know, on the floor. I think that my studio was called Mansfield. And
Oh, that was my studio too.
Yeah, I was just so, was it yours too?
Yeah.
So I don't know if, when were you there again? Because I was there in 2016 and I had this one of those little tombstone things. I was learning how to write my name in Khmer actually. And so I wrote my name on there, and I thought that was really important for me, just in connection with like exploring my history and my heritage and my people's stories. I was actively trying to also write in Khmer my name on that little tombstone to mark the time that I'd been at MacDowell. So when were you there, Julie?
I was in Mansfield twice. I think I was there in 2005 and in 2006. And it was my first studio experience at MacDowell. And so it's sort of just like the place that felt like this magical cottage, you know, in a wonderland out of which flowed, you know, work that I didn't know I could do. So I love that the origin story of this book is connected to that place. I feel like you may have that in common with a lot of writers. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much. What about you, Elif?
So the Idiot is a autobiographical novel. And I wrote the first draft. So it's based on stuff that happened to me in my first year of college, which was in 1995 to 96. And I started writing about it while it was happening. And I turned it into a novel, like right around, I don't know, like 9/11 happened in the middle of it. So like I was still in my 20s and I was in grad school. And then I edited it for publication. It came out in 2017. And the reason it came out then was because I had a meltdown while I was trying to write the book that I was supposed to write. And I ended up realizing that everything had somehow originated in this, in what I had thought was this kind of irrelevant throwaway episode from my life in my first year of college. So then that book came out, and then I then had the experience of promoting it in the early weeks of the Trump presidency and during Me Too. And that was a super intense experience. And I was promoting the Italian translation right after Matteo Salvini was like the rise of the Italian version of Trumpism, basically. So I had these two different episodes of explaining why to some readers. So the book that I just finished now, Either Or, is a response to some feedback that I got from readers. And one question that I heard a lot was, why did you write a book that was so apolitical? Or why is the main character, why doesn't she read more newspapers? Why isn't she more into politics? And the second question that I got asked from like a lot of people, including some, book reviewers and like, interviewers for magazines, someone called from a newspaper in Norway, was why do the characters not have sex? Why does the main character not have sex with the guy who she has a crush on for the whole book? And I was thinking about it and I was like, clearly this is something that really upset, like it actually, like a girl who I barely knew came up to me at a party and she was like really angry about it. She was like, I kept waiting for their relationship to be consummated. And like, there was one of the reviews also like in the New York Times, it was like, people sounded like they were really upset. So, and I thought about it and I was like, I too was really upset about that back in the 90s at the time that it was happening. I had this feeling that like, my life had gone off the rails and it wasn't complete. And actually, when I went back to school the next year, I went into this like deep spiral where I embraced a lot of beliefs about heterosexuality, heteronormativity, the novel, literature, what a literary life is, what I was going to do to redeem the suffering of my parents, which was, as Monica was just saying, was something that they really did a lot to try to protect me from. But of course, you find out about it and it starts to make you feel horrible. And so for me, that was the avenue that I went in anyway. So I just realized that I needed to write another book, which is like kind of a crazy thing to realize because there were like 4 books that I wanted to write before this. And I already felt kind of embarrassed for like, oh, like, why did I write a whole book about this stuff that happened to me when I was like a freshman in college? And now I wrote a whole book about my sophomore year in college. But I got to the bottom of a lot of stuff for myself. And this is a much more political one. I tried to basically, in the past years since The Idiot came out, I became aware that I have a queer consciousness and a political consciousness, and Either Or is my attempt to reconstruct for myself what the factors are that made me not realize that until my late 30s and early 40s.
Thank you. That's awesome. And it's just so rich with insight into your process and your mind. I'm just wondering, another one of the questions, and I'm fascinated by this too, because it seems like one of the most challenging things we do, which is to bring some kind of overarching idea into the narrative art or into the lyric art. And so that's what this question is about. Is there one core idea that you wanted more than anything else to shed light on or to say something about with your book? And I guess I don't mean, did you know that in advance? You can answer this question ex post facto. Did you recognize that there was something that you were trying to do with this book? Chelsea.
Yeah, I think it's really evident to me now, of course, and probably while writing it too, in a way, was that I really wanted to characterize this experience of sort of losing one's mother, but the mother doesn't die. So the mother is just in the world existing as well, but there's been a huge loss there. And the narrator of my book loses her mother in this way. sort of mysterious way, but she knows that she's not dead. So there's sort of this ambiguous grief that goes on. That's something that I experienced in my own life, and I was always searching for this. I don't think I ever knew to call it grief for a really long time.
Right.
But once I realized that, of course, I've been experiencing grief for most of my life over this loss, I wanted to bring that into the novel. And that's really the central thread of the book, I think. Like, a lot of other things are happening situationally, but the heart of it, the emotional drive, is this teenager having to go through this strange feeling of loss, and also sort of a loss that's not really recognized as loss. There's no funeral, there's no real closure to it ever, because it continues to evolve, yet there's still no return of that parent. So that was always kind of at the center, and it was definitely an idea I was exploring. And then, other things branched off from that. Religion and belief in faith is a huge part of it too. But I think they all return back to that original loss of that this girl experiences.
That's great. I don't know if this is going to connect, but it seems to me that, I don't know, what you said, Chelsea, was so resonant with some of the ideas that were nested in Monica's book too, but in quite a different way. These losses that are historical and that are internalized. And I wonder if that was the sort of idea core of the book, or if there were other ideas that were driving your book, Monica.
Yeah, I am really glad to hear Chelsea talk about grief and loss. Something that I was really conscious about while writing my first book of poems is I was really conscious of like the trauma narrative and also trauma porn that is so inherent in the publishing industry. And I try to do my very best to subvert that gaze. So something that I noticed as I was revising the book long after I had written the poems, I was just really hacking away at editing and killing my darlings. I realized, like, in the last month before I was about to submit to my press, that I was really writing a book that centered intergenerationality. So what I mean by that is that I identify as a second generation Khmer woman. I think of my parents as first generation, and I think that a lot of the literature I've read about Cambodia are survival literature. They're classified as such, and those are the stories that my parents' generation have been able to tell about their own personal accounts of the Khmer Rouge regime. And so I was exploring that same history, but I'd never wanted anyone to think that I was someone who was writing a book about an experience that I had lived through, because I did not live through that experience of genocide. So it was really important for me to let these other voices speak, as though they were speaking to me, to tell me the story, me as in the second generation, the younger generation. I was hoping to use those persona poems as a way to tell myself the story as I was writing these poems. So that is something that I noticed. And something else I was aware of was this theme of nostalgia that is often, is something that I feel the Cambodian narrative is pigeonholed into, the trauma and the nostalgia. And I was really trying to celebrate as well. So when Chelsea spoke about grief, I was also thinking about desire. I was also thinking about celebration, as I was also reflecting on those same themes. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. And Elif, what would you say was the kind of pulsing idea at the core of that first book, and maybe the idea that nests at the core of this one, if it differs?
Yeah, I think in the first book, the reason that I had to write it was related to the role of. I was thinking a lot about novels and what novels are, and I came from a literary criticism background of studying novels, and I think I was really wrestling with the role of love, of what I thought of as love, which was a heterosexual relationship of a certain kind, and it's how that plays into the novel. And I think the reason that I ended up writing about something that happened so long ago was because that was a story where at the end they don't get together, but it didn't feel like it made the book a failure or a tragedy the way that it would have if I was writing a book about, a woman who was in her late 30s and it doesn't work out with the man. That would have like a completely different valence. Then with the sequel, it was much more explicitly to me a book about ideas, about explaining. I went in with some real, I read Adrienne Rich's essay, Compulsory Heterosexuality, which is about how women's relationships with other women are sort of insidiously devalued from the outside, and that women come to identify their role with being consumed by men in some way. And I wanted to, instead of writing an essay about that, I wanted to describe what it felt like, because in a lot of ways it feels amazing, otherwise nobody would do it. So that was what I wanted to do. And that was an idea that was very much on the forefront of my mind. And I guess insofar as there's anything that I discovered while I was writing it, it actually goes a lot to what Monica was just talking about, which was I realized the extent to which the stakes for everything in my life in college and my decision to become a writer were raised by the idea that I had to compensate for stuff that happened to my mother that I didn't know about. And I had to compensate for my own good fortune and having been born in America and in having all of these opportunities. And I really had to do something with it, or else I was going to be like a complete dishonor. And this constant sense of nothing, that's like the little thing that I read at the beginning where she's like, she remembers this thing about someone in a gulag, and then she's like, oh God, I'm such an asshole because I'm comparing myself to someone in a prison camp. It just feels like one of the things that happens to second generation people, or later generation people, is this constant you weren't in it, you weren't in the genocide. I know, I'm so lucky, I'm a piece of shit, nothing happened to me, nothing. And it's not a very, of course it's important to recognize what happened to which people, but I think it's not a very politically salutary thing for a lot of people to go around thinking, devaluing their own experiences like that. So that was something that emerged for me in the course of writing.
That's great. I'm so glad that you mentioned that, simply because I feel like one of the things that I'd like to talk about next is how we sort of claim our voices as writers, and how we start to see ourselves as writers. And part of that seems to me to be about feeling like we are allowed to tell the stories that we want to tell. And that can be very difficult, especially when those stories come out of a long history of trauma that we don't always share. But I wonder if we can now talk about that a little bit, about the process of entering into a writing life and how you begin to understand yourself as an artist. One question that came up in the discussions that we had before this event was what early support means for a writer, what it means to have a fellowship for a young writer who is engaged in the work, but maybe hasn't had as much recognition yet as others around her. And maybe if you can talk a little bit about the opportunities that a fellowship gives you to really focus on the work instead of all the other things that make noise in your life, and maybe what it means to receive that kind of validation early on. This is a question for anybody who wants to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you're speaking, oh.
Sorry, Chelsea, no, go ahead. No, we'll follow the order. I'm just I'll talk after you.
I was just going to say, as Julie was talking about that, the word everything popped into my mind so many times. It's everything. That support is everything. It was for me. I feel like, going to MacDowell it totally changed my life. I mean, the people I met there observing the way that they engaged in their art life and being in that environment where you're having that close contact with other artists all the time, it just changes you, I think. And you realize that you're in the room with them, you're also doing it. And that's really powerful. And I think that's important. And for me, I mean, the writers that I stayed in contact with from then are some of my best friends to this day that read my work, and we've continued the dialogue from there. And so I feel like it's so valuable, and it also, there's so much loneliness in writing in a way when you're not really having that engagement yet, and you're just doing this practice for so long. And so having that confirmation that you're doing something good, that you're on some kind of track with it is, I think it's really important.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I after hearing you, yes, sorry, I'm just like, I'm eager to talk, I guess. After hearing Chelsea talk about like the people that she met, I mean, I'm thinking of people that I met as well. And what that early support meant for me, I was fresh out of my MFA program. I was pondering questions that like Elif had just shared. Questions like, well, do I deserve to write about this story, even though I didn't live through it? Like that whole idea of like valuing your own experience, valuing your craft and your own, just like kind of like creating that life for yourself and carving that out. I think that this fellowship like really helped me see myself a little bit, like against erasure, because I feel like I'm writing against erasure. I'm trying to recreate a narrative that has been really pigeonholed inside of this trauma narrative. And so when with the early support, being around these amazing artists, one of my friends is a sculptor. Another friend was working on her memoir, and got me thinking that I could write a memoir as well. So there was just so many avenues of possibility. I remember like having fun after dinner, like after eating dessert. Hello, dessert. That was every night dessert. Playing pool, playing games, and then going back to my little studio to write poems and possibly build a fire. And I say possibly because I failed several times too, but that was where I first learned how to build a fire. And I think that did something for my process. And being in the woods, I think having that particular experience was so special. And having this radical care, getting lunch baskets delivered by Blake, and just having no worry in the world, just so that I could write this book. And I think writing about a history of genocide is just very psychically draining in so many ways, so that when I knew that it was 6 o'clock, I could go to dinner, I could rest. And resting, I think, is such an important part of that early support that you get as a writer. At least like on this residency that I was on, I felt like that was really important, to rest and do the work and learn how to carve out that life of a writer. Yeah.
Thanks, Monica.
I've been thinking a lot about, in the past few years, about how the political status quo is maintained despite people knowing that it's wrong in all kinds of ways. And I think a big part of that is that we're not encouraged. In fact, we're strongly discouraged from taking time out of doing the things that we do to like generate value in different ways in order to just think about what happened, to really think about our childhood, to think about what's actually going on, what is actually a family, what is a society, what were we thinking and feeling at the different times that we did things. That's not an activity that we're encouraged to do by any means. And that's partly how we are able to go through, like if you look at the levels of government, you just see so much self-deception that's going on, and nobody's really, it's a gender issue. Like, it's not manly to sit and think about these things. And it's like, you're not supposed to be complaining. And there's, all of these reasons. So I was just actually thinking that's actually a profoundly radical thing for there to be some kind of organization that's telling people what you have to say, like you taking yourself out of this like constant, treadmill of value generation in order to just analyze what's happening and think about your feelings and try to articulate what's happening from your own perspective is something that we believe in, and something that's a legitimate activity that fits into a schedule where you get up in the morning and go to bed at night. And it's not some like weird thing that you do on the outside of the human condition. It's so meaningful and it's so valuable. And for me, the Rona Jaffe Award, it changed everything. In 2007, I had just finished a PhD program, and I was thinking, like, can I become a writer, or do I have to go in the academic job market? What am I allowed to say? What am I entitled to say? And just any kind of vote of confidence that was like, why don't you just say the thing that you want to say, was so valuable and meaningful to me, and was, one of a series of little islands of encouragement like that go, throughout a person's career that one can point at, and that they just constantly mean everything against sort of an onslaught of the contrary. That's my feeling.
Yeah, well, that is such it's such a powerful idea to think about how a fellowship opens room for you creatively against the other forces that might be pulling at you, and just the ways that it creates space. We often talk about whether MacDowell is a place or whether it's a thing, a sort of idea, and I feel like it's both of those things at once. It preserves the kind of quiet that Monica was talking about, both physically in the world and in the mind. And not only that, but it also introduces the possibility for conversation. When you talked about, Monica, the gift of dessert and how it felt like a miracle that dessert would arrive and we would get to experience that together. One of the things that I feel like the colony has done, and that it's doing right now in partnership with the Rona Jaffe Foundation, is giving us a kind of like ongoing dessert. Like, here we are having a conversation among writers who share this fellowship and who now are in closer contact with one another's work. The experience of reading your work in preparation for this conversation just opened my mind in so many different directions I couldn't have anticipated. And it's a dessert that MacDowell continues to give us, the gift of the fellowship that we have with one another. And I think that one of the reasons we're sitting here tonight is because that feeling is not inward facing. MacDowell intends for that feeling to go out into the world and into the minds of those who read and appreciate the arts and are looking for the kind of rich exchange of ideas that MacDowell fosters, and that it has done so beautifully for more than 10 years now in partnership with the Rona Jaffe Foundation. So I really want to thank all of you for being willing to be with us tonight. For those of you who are watching us, for just entering into this conversation with us and being present with us as we talk about these ideas. It's just exciting for me to hear what's been going on inside your minds and what might be coming from your pens. MacDowell and Rona Jaffe would love to thank Elif, Chelsea, and Monica for your participation tonight. It really was such an incredible gift, you guys. You can find more about these writers and more information about our organization in the credits that are going to follow this event. And again, I encourage all of you to pick up their marvelous books. So thanks once again to all of you, and have a great night.